I never thought missing a single month's rent could make my entire life feel so small. It wasn't just the money. It was the silence that followed every ignored call. The way the walls of my apartment felt closer each night, like they were waiting for me to fail. I had always paid on time before. Always been responsible. Then one bad stretch turned into another, and suddenly I was behind with no clear way out. I told myself it was temporary, that something would work out, but hope doesn't pay rent, that I lived alone, and that loneliness amplified everything. There was no one to split the worry with, no one to help shoulder the panic that settled in my chest every evening. I'd lie awake counting hours instead of sheep, calculating how many days I had before the landlord would take action. Each notification on my phone made my heart race. When his messages finally came, they were polite at first, almost understanding. He said he knew times were hard. He said he just wanted to talk. That kindness somehow made it worse, because it left me no excuse to hide behind anger that I avoided him for longer than I should have. I convinced myself that if I didn't open the door, the problem would pause. It didn't. The final message was short and direct. He wanted to meet in person to figure something out. He added that he might bring a couple of friends along, people who could help discuss options. That line stuck with me. Friends. Options. I read it over and over, trying to hear it in a neutral tone, but something about it unsettled me. Still, I agreed. What choice did I really have? Eviction felt like a cliff edge, and this meeting felt like the last narrow bridge before it. I cleaned the apartment even though it didn't matter. I straightened things that didn't need straightening. Anything to keep my hands busy and my thoughts from spiraling. I practiced what I would say, how I would explain myself without sounding desperate, without sounding weak. I promised myself I wouldn't beg. When the knock finally came, it felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just people on the other side. I took a breath before opening the door, reminding myself that this was just a conversation, that I was still in control of my choices. The landlord stood there, just as I remembered him, but he wasn't alone. Two men stood slightly behind him, relaxed, almost too comfortable for a rent discussion. They smiled in a way that didn't reach their eyes. The air changed the moment they stepped inside. The apartment felt smaller with them in it, and I became acutely aware of my own situation, my unpaid rent, my dependence, my vulnerability. They sat like they belonged there, like this was their space too. The landlord spoke calmly, explaining that he wanted to help me, that he didn't want things to get ugly. His friends nodded along, adding comments about how life sometimes demands flexibility, how problems can be solved in unexpected ways. As I listened, I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. There was an unspoken layer beneath every word, something heavy and uncomfortable that pressed against my chest. I felt seen in a way I hadn't asked for, evaluated not as a tenant but as a person with leverage being weighed against her worth. Part of me wanted to stand up and end it right there. Another part, quieter but stronger, reminded me of how close I was to losing everything. I told myself I would just listen, just hear them out, just survive this conversation. I didn't know then that simply staying, simply not saying no right away, was already the beginning of a line I would soon cross. After that day, I changed my behavior in ways only I noticed. I answered messages later than usual. I made excuses to cut visits short. When my daughter invited us both over, I made sure other people were present. On the surface, everything looked the same. Inside, I was constantly alert, measuring every word, every glance. I told myself this was control, that this was me protecting my family. But control is harder to maintain when your thoughts betray you in silence. He respected the distance at first. Or at least he appeared to. He became quieter, more careful. Yet his restraint only made things worse. There was something heavier in his pauses, something unresolved in the way he avoided my eyes and then looked back as if drawn against his will. I could sense the struggle in him, and instead of comforting me, it unsettled me deeply. I didn't want to be the cause of anyone's weakness, especially not his. Then came the messages. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing I could point to and call wrong. Simple questions. Small updates. Polite concern. That made them harder to shut down. Ignoring him felt cruel. Responding felt dangerous. I convinced myself that kindness did not equal permission. I reminded myself that maturity meant staying composed even when others faltered. Still, each reply lingered longer in my thoughts than it should have. What disturbed me most was how easily he spoke about feeling alone. about pressure, about expectations he felt he couldn't voice elsewhere. I never encouraged it, but I listened. And listening became its own betrayal. I knew better. I knew emotional doors, once opened, rarely close cleanly. Yet part of me justified it by telling myself that I was only offering guidance, that I was being a steady presence. The truth was harder to face. I liked being needed at a tea night. Guilt settled into my chest like a weight. I imagined my daughter's face, her trust so absolute it bordered on innocence. I asked myself how I could even entertain these thoughts when she had given me nothing but love. The answer frightened me because it had nothing to do with her and everything to do with me. I was lonely. I was aging. I had spent years being strong for others without anyone noticing the quiet emptiness it left behind. He never crossed the line openly again, but the tension lived in what he didn't say, in the way he paused before leaving, in the restraint that felt rehearsed. Once during a brief moment alone, he looked at me and said he was trying to do the right thing. His voice shook when he said it. I told him he had no choice but to do the right thing. The words sounded firm, but my heart betrayed me by pounding too fast. I hated myself for that reaction. I hated that my body responded before my conscience could intervene. I spent days afterward punishing myself with distance and silence. I told myself this would end if I was disciplined enough. But desire does not disappear simply because it is unwelcome. It waits. It tests patience. It looks for cracks. The crack came quietly. A moment when I should have walked away, ended the conversation, protected everyone involved. Instead, I stayed. I listened longer than I should have. I didn't stop him when he spoke honestly about what he felt. I didn't encourage him, but I didn't shut it down either. And in that hesitation, I crossed a line I had sworn I never would. Nothing happened then, but something changed irrevocably. I realized with a sinking certainty that resisting him was no longer the only battle. I was now resisting myself. I tried to do the right thing. I really did. I pulled back, focused on my marriage, told myself this discomfort was a warning, not an invitation. For a few days I stayed quiet. I didn't message him. I didn't let my thoughts wander. I convinced myself that discipline alone could fix what neglect had created. But discipline doesn't fill emotional gaps. It just makes you more aware of them. My husband barely noticed the change. He was wrapped up in his own world, his stress, his distractions. When I suggested we spend time together, he said he was too tired. When I stopped suggesting, he didn't ask why. That indifference hurt more than any argument could have. It made me feel invisible, like my presence or absence carried the same weight. Eventually, the silence between me and his friend broke again, almost accidentally. A short message. A harmless question. I hesitated before replying, staring at the screen like it might judge me. When I finally responded, the relief was immediate, and that scared me. The conversation flowed naturally, as if it had been waiting for permission to continue. No flirting. No lines crossed. Just honesty layered with restraint. We talked about stress, about feeling stuck, about how life sometimes turns into a series of obligations with no space to breathe. I shared things I hadn't said out loud in years. He didn't try to fix me. He didn't minimize my feelings. He simply stayed present. That presence became addictive. I started noticing the emotional shift in myself. I looked forward to hearing from him. I felt lighter after we talked. At the same time, the guilt grew heavier. I hated that I felt more understood by someone who wasn't my husband. I hated that I was comparing them even though I tried not to. The comparison happened anyway, quietly and constantly. One evening, he admitted something that changed the tone of everything. He said he'd noticed how unhappy I seemed for a long time but hadn't known if it was his place to say anything. The way he said it wasn't possessive or suggestive. It was careful, respectful. That made it harder to ignore what was forming between us. This wasn't reckless desire. It was emotional intimacy unfolding slowly. Deliberately, I found myself opening up in ways I never had before. I spoke about feeling unchosen, about adjusting myself to avoid conflict, about how lonely it feels to be married to someone who no longer looks at you with curiosity. Saying those things out loud made them real. It also made me realize how deep the disconnect in my marriage had become. There were moments when we both pulled back, acknowledging the situation without naming it directly. We knew this wasn't simple. We knew the risks. And yet, neither of us walked away. The restraint only intensified the bond, giving it a seriousness that felt impossible to dismiss as harmless. The first time our conversation turned personal in a way that felt undeniably intimate, I panicked. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it felt true. I told myself this was emotional cheating, even if nothing physical had happened. I told myself to stop. He agreed we should be careful. But neither of us said goodbye. I began to realize that the real betrayal wasn't happening in words or actions. It was happening in my heart. I had started turning toward someone else for comfort, for validation, for connection. And once that shift occurs, pretending it hasn't happened becomes a performance you can only maintain for so long. I stood at a crossroads, knowing that whatever came next would define who I was willing to become. I could either keep denying the truth, or face the consequences of acknowledging it. What I didn't yet understand was that choosing awareness doesn't prevent damage. It simply makes you conscious of every step as you walk toward it. I wish I could say there was a single moment where everything clearly broke, where I could point to 1 second and say that's when I lost control. But it didn't happen like that. It unfolded in fragments, in silences that lasted too long, in looks that carried meaning we both pretended not to see. By the time I admitted the truth to myself, the truth had already settled in comfortably. The conversations changed first. They grew heavier, slower, filled with pauses that said more than words ever could. We talked less about grief and more about ourselves, about what we missed, about who we used to be before life narrowed us down into roles and responsibilities. I heard myself say things I hadn't planned to say. Confession slipped out without resistance, and instead of pulling back, he leaned in. There was a night when the loneliness felt unbearable. My son had checked on me earlier, reminding me to rest, reminding me that I wasn't alone. After he left, the house fell quiet again. That familiar ache returned, sharper this time, mixed with something restless. When I reached out to the other man, it wasn't an accident. I knew exactly why I was doing it. I just didn't want to face what it meant. We met under the excuse of needing to talk. No one touched at first. We sat close enough to feel each other's presence, close enough for restraint to feel like effort. When our hands brushed, neither of us pulled away. That hesitation, that failure to stop, mattered more than anything else. It was the moment I stopped pretending this was harmless. What followed wasn't reckless or loud. It was quiet, intimate, and heavy with emotion. There was no passion without consequence, no escape without cost. Even as I let myself feel wanted, comforted, alive again, a part of me stood back and watched in disbelief. I knew I was betraying something sacred, not just my marriage but my own values. That knowledge didn't stop me. It only followed me afterward. The guilt arrived immediately. It sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't shift. I went home and scrubbed my hands as if that could erase what I had allowed to happen. I avoided mirrors because I didn't want to see the version of myself that stared back without innocence. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was filled with restless thoughts and unfinished sentences. The days that followed were worse. I became careful in ways that made everything obvious. I guarded my phone. I measured my words. I forced smiles around my son, hating myself for the secrets standing between us. He trusted me completely. That trust burned more than any fear of being discovered, that I told myself it wouldn't happen again. I told myself it was a moment of weakness, a response to grief, something I could lock away and move past. But the truth was uglier. I wanted the feeling back. I missed the way I had felt seen, even knowing the cost. That craving scared me more than the act itself. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. And every step forward after that felt heavier, because I wasn't just hiding what I had done. I was hiding who I was becoming, and I didn't know how to stop.